Welcome everybody to the 40th and final program of 2021 for Urban Green, but I'm pretty sure we saved the best for last, and I appreciate everybody that's joined us today. I want to thank the NYU study team that will be introduced, and you'll hear from them in a bit, for all the great work they've done over the last couple of years on this study, and for the report out today. Carbon trading is an issue we've been thinking about for many years at Urban Green. Starting back actually with the formation of Local Law 97, we were instrumental in advocating for this study that you will hear about today to be actually placed in the law. We followed that up actually with a global convening that we did on the issue of carbon trading in conjunction with London, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Toronto, to really span the world and understand how could carbon trading work as a new breakthrough policy tool at the city level for buildings. We culminated that in a report that we published called Trading. Now, at the risk of confusion, this isn't the NYU study, but this is a report we released last year that involved 50 stakeholders and 11 meetings that we put together. We covered 11 program design questions and 59 policy options that any city could cover while evaluating carbon trading for building. And what I'm excited about the work that was done here is that it explores how trading can actually benefit environmental justice areas by providing a new capital stream for decarbonization while enhancing the success of Local Law 97. So I'm really thrilled that we have the report out today. I think we're in for a good program. And with that, I want to turn it over to today's moderator, Chris Halfnight, who's the Director of Policy at Urban Green. Chris, take it away.
Thanks very much, John. Hi, everybody. As John said, I'm Chris Halfnight, Director of Policy here at Urban Green. Delighted to be with you this afternoon, and I'll be moderating the panel today. I'm joined by the core members of the Carbon Trading Study Team. We have Danielle Spiegelfeld, who is Executive Director at the Guarini Center on Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law at NYU. She's also a principal on the study team. I'm also joined by Mary Jiang, who is Senior Analyst at HR&A Advisors and conducted extensive building sector analysis for the study. And then I'm also joined by Casper Spokus, who is an associate at the Brattle Group, who worked on the optimization modeling that looks at the energy system and building owner decision-making to inform the study. I'm going to give just a very quick couple of background notes, and then I'll turn it over to Danielle, who's going to give us a presentation on the goals, the methods, the findings of the study. Then I'll come back to moderate a Q&A with the panelists. We'll cover as much ground as we can, and then we'll save about 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. So again, please put any questions you have at any point during the presentations or discussions into the Q&A function on Zoom. So I think everybody on this program probably knows that Local Law 97 sets carbon emission caps for many of the city's large buildings that kick in 2024, and then they tighten over time through to 2050. What we have right now is essentially cap but no trade, and the focus today is to look at what would happen under the law if we shifted that from cap and no trade to cap and trade. Local Law 97 also, as John mentioned, required this feasibility study and an implementation plan development to look at carbon trading as a compliance option for buildings under the law. I want to emphasize that today's topic really is breaking new ground in at least two key ways. There are a number of trading programs for pollution and emissions trading around the world, but they mostly operate at the regional, national, or even international level. And they also cover large emitters, typically power plants or large industrial emitters. Today, we're looking at a different kind of program, one that would operate at the city level and is building focused. So many more regulated entities that are much smaller in nature. There's really only one fully operational building level, city level trading program in the world, and that's in Tokyo. Tokyo's had a carbon cap and trade program for buildings for about a decade now, but it only covers about 1,200 buildings, and they're all non-residential. They're commercial and industrial. And actually, there hasn't been very much trading in that program because the covered entities have reached their targets through on-site efficiency and other measures instead of buying credits from other buildings. So what we're talking about today really is new territory. Under Local Law 97 in New York City, we're talking about trading of a whole other scale. Very broadly, I think we're also focused on this topic because many recognize that trading may have the potential to make Local Law 97 better. And I say may with purpose because there's a lot to unpack in terms of what the right policy design is and the right guardrails that may need to be in place to ensure that trading achieves the objectives we all want it to achieve. But the upside, if we can get it right, is significant. Trading could potentially drive the same or better pollution outcome at a lower societal cost. It could add flexibility for significant variation in how and when buildings are ready to do retrofits, whether that's tenants, equipment turnover, access to capital at different points in time. It could also help keep compliance dollars in Local Law 97 flowing into building retrofits in New York City rather than other compliance options or potentially fines. And then lastly, it could help drive earlier action than we might get otherwise. The law as it stands now almost incentivizes owners to wait until the last minute before the caps tighten for the next compliance period. So all that to say, there are significant challenges to unpack, but also a lot of opportunity, and that's part of what makes this such a worthwhile subject to explore. So with that, I'm going to invite Danielle to pull up some slides and walk us through the study's goals, methods, and findings. Danielle.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris, for your kind introduction, and also to all of your colleagues at Urban Green. Thank you very much for your efforts to really catalyze thinking around this issue in New York City. Sorry, just trying to get my share screen to function correctly. Okay.
There we go.
So what were the goals for the carbon trading study? The overarching goal that we were tasked with was to evaluate how adding a carbon trading program to Local Law 97 would change outcomes. And we looked at this question from the perspective of different stakeholder groups, including, very importantly, environmental justice communities and other communities throughout the city. A second goal of the carbon trading study, as Chris alluded to, was to examine whether trading could be leveraged to try to drive investment into environmental justice communities. In other words, we were looking to see whether the inclusion of a trading option into Local Law 97 might increase the level of investment that buildings in environmental justice communities would otherwise experience. So as you can see, environmental justice concerns were really central to our study. And so one of the early tasks for the team was to define which areas of the city would be classified as EJCs. We used two metrics for this purpose. First, we looked at those at hospitalization rates due to asthma. And second, we looked at high school graduation rates. Areas that were in the bottom 40% for either metric were classified as EJCs. And you can see these areas in the map in purple and blue. One thing that I should note is that the study team was mindful of the fact that there was a separate ongoing process in the city to define environmental justice communities. And we did not pretend that this was the definition that the city would adopt either for carbon trading or for other purposes throughout New York City's rulemaking processes, but we needed to come up with a definition for modeling in the immediate future, and so we used these criteria. The other thing I should mention is that the Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability made clear at the outset that trading would not be viable if it would result in any increase in any local air pollutant in environmental justice communities between the years of 2024 and 2050, when Local Law 97 would be in place, compared to what would otherwise obtain under 97 without trading. So in other words, if any particular program design were projected to lead to this increase in an air pollutant, such as NOx, SOx, or particulate matter, that design would be rejected. All right, so how did we go about this process? The first thing that we needed to do in order to assess the impacts of adding a trading program to 97 was to create a very detailed understanding as to what the projected impacts of 97 without trading would be. This would become the base case for analysis against which we would measure the impact of a trading program. So once we had the base case at hand, the model for the base case at hand, we then proceeded to layer on top of that model different carbon trading program designs. And we started out with a very simple program design, right? Like just everyone who's covered with a 97 cap can trade amongst themselves, but there are no particular bells and whistles, nothing to intentionally drive investment or reductions towards EJCs, no rules around being able to bank credits that you might acquire early on for use in the future, et cetera. From here, we started to vary the different levers that a policymaker could play with in designing a trading program to see which levers might best advance the city's particular goals. And at the end of that process, we came up with two proposals, which we call illustrative proposals, that we thought could effectively further the city's objectives. All right, so I'm going to turn to the findings about the base case and about carbon trading in just a moment. But before I do, I wanted to highlight a couple of findings about the base case, that is local N97 without trading, that we thought were really important and which ultimately impacted some of the results that we saw about the inclusion of trading. So the first and most important thing, I think, to note about local N97 is that the pace at which New York State decarbonizes the electricity grid will have a very significant impact on the stringency of the local N97 caps. If electricity is decarbonized at the pace that the state established in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, 51% of the square footage that local I-97 covers will comply with their 2024 and 2030 caps without having to take any action. What this means is that just by virtue of the emissions from the grid supplied electricity falling, these buildings will see their emissions fall substantially enough that they won't need to take any action to bring their properties into compliance with the city law. Now, when you combine the effects of grid decarbonization with the energy cost savings that building owners can anticipate receiving when they make investments in energy efficiency and the types of retrofits that Local Law 97 seeks to incentivize, our modeling predicts that Local Law 97 will actually save the average building owner money over 2024 to 2050. So this is really an indication of just how dramatically CLCPA grid decarbonization could change the stringency of Local Law 97 from what some might have expected before the state's law was passed. Another way of looking at the impacts of grid decarbonization is presented in this graph here. So the red line above depicts the aggregate citywide emissions at the level that Local Law 97 caps, right? So you can see over time, citywide emissions have to decline as indicated by the red line. The blue line is the baseline emissions, meaning the emissions of covered buildings at 2018, the last year before Local Law 97 was passed. But we've adjusted those emissions to account for grid decarbonization at the pace that the CLCPA has set. And what you can see is that citywide emissions, assuming grid decarbonization, will be below the LL97 aggregate cap all the way until 2050, okay? Now, this all being the case, it's very important to recognize that 97 will not be easy for all buildings to comply with. And what we see in particular is that it's much easier for the commercial sector to comply with than the residential sector. My colleague Mary will talk through some of the reasons for this, I think, later on, but for now, I just want to highlight the effect. So if you look at 2024, what you see is that the law imposes roughly equivalent challenge for buildings that are residential versus commercial. Most buildings in both groups will fairly easily meet their targets. As time goes on, the picture changes. If you look over at 2040, which is the year at which the state has mandated that electricity from the grid become net zero, you can see that all of a sudden 93% of commercial buildings will be under their cap, under business as usual, as opposed to only 28% of residential buildings. So the compliance burden is not felt equally by all sectors. All right, so now turning to the meat of the subject for today, carbon trading. How does it work? How might it help the situation? So the basic insight behind trading is that some buildings can reduce their emissions at less cost than others, okay? And trading seeks to take advantage of that. So let me just unpack what I mean by this a bit. Let's imagine that there were only two covered buildings in New York City, Building A and Building B. Now, Building A over the years has done a lot to try to reduce its energy usage, right? It's picked all the low-hanging fruit. But for whatever reason, maybe it has a very high energy using tenant, very densely occupied, who knows? For whatever reason, it's still going to be above its local Law 97 limit. And in order for that building to come below its limit, it would have to implement some sort of expensive measures, okay? Now we have Building B. Building B has not done much over the years at all to reduce energy. And it can easily not only get to its local Law 97 cap with low cost investments, but it can even reduce below its local Law 97 cap. Under trading, what happens is that instead of Building A shelling out for the expensive energy conservation measures on its property, it pays Building B to reduce its energy usage. The result is that you get the same reduction in emissions, but at lower cost, okay? So that's the basic intuition behind trading. Trading programs can be structured in a number of different ways. Among other variables, regulators can adjust the method of initially allocating the credits. So in other words, you know, how do the buildings get credits to begin with? Do they buy them at auction? Are they given them for free? Do they generate them by taking certain actions? Regulators can play with whether there should be a price floor, in other words, a minimum price for sale, and if so, what that price should be. They can permit banking or not. Banking would mean that you acquire a stockpile of emissions credits in one point of time, and you could use them perhaps far into the future at another compliance period. And then there are a number of measures that regulators can take to try to improve outcomes for environmental justice communities, including measures to drive investment towards environmental justice communities, to shift pollution reductions away or towards environmental justice communities so there's less pollution in EJCs and more. So working with these variable elements, as I mentioned, the team went through a process of testing out different levers and seeing how they would affect outcomes, how they would advance, whether they would advance the city's particular goals. And ultimately, we came up with these two proposals. These represent really two options on a spectrum, right? The first proposal, the one that's called number one, is more sort of aggressive, more interventionist. The one on the number two on my right is more sort of a light touch approach. And there's lots of variation that could have been developed in between, but we thought that these two options represented two sort of appropriate options for how to achieve the city's objectives. So looking at the first proposal, the biggest difference is between this and the second is the method of allocating credits to the building owners, okay? So I'm gonna focus on those first. So under the option number one, building owners who are in environmental justice communities are freely given credits equal to 100% of their local N97 caps. Buildings outside of environmental justice communities, however, are only given credits equal to 70% of their local N97 caps for free. The remaining 30% of credits they need to purchase at auction, okay? Now, the revenue from the auction is used to invest in energy efficiency and electrification retrofits in environmental justice communities. Under Proposal 2, there's no auction. Instead, buildings can voluntarily choose to generate credits if they emit less than they are allowed to emit, and also less than their 2018 baseline. So if they're below their 97 caps and their baseline emissions, they can generate a credit, which could then be purchased by a building that's looking for an alternative compliance mechanism. In order to drive investment towards EJCs and also increase the amount of pollution that is reduced in these areas, this proposal also assumes that the City Council moves forward with contemplated plans to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuel oil number 4. All right, so in a nutshell, the key findings, it's a pretty happy story. So both designs compared to local N97 without trading reduce more GHG emissions from buildings in the city, avoid more premature deaths from local pollution, and reduce costs for owners. But there are important differences between the two proposals. The auction proposal is more net beneficial in our cost benefit analysis. And this is largely because it reduces local pollutants more than the non-auction proposal. But the auction proposal is also more complicated to establish, more complicated to administer, which are not costs that were included in our cost benefit analysis. And it saves owners less money. So in short, I would say that while both proposals are beneficial, neither is strictly superior to the other. And really the choice between them, if any, would depend on the particular policy priorities of the next administration. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Chris.
Great, thanks so much, Danielle. That was a super helpful overview of the study and its findings. I'm going to invite Mary and Kasparis to join us again, and we'll move to a moderated Q&A with all the panelists. So my first question, I think we heard from Danielle, there's sort of two big categories in the study. One is looking at the local law 97 base case, just what is going to happen under local law 97 as is. And then two is looking at trading as an overlay there. And I want to focus for a second on that base case, and there's some interesting findings coming out of there. As you mentioned, Danielle, the study found that if we meet statewide the CLCPA mandates, that's a state level decarbonization law that passed shortly after local law 97. If we meet that, the grid decarbonization will do a lot of the heavy lifting. It will drive most of the emissions reductions necessary for a lot of buildings to hit the targets in local law 97. There's a lot of modeling behind that. So Kasparis, I'm going to turn to you first and just ask, how realistic are the study's assumptions around that grid decarbonization and its pace? And then secondly, I know that the team did a modeling based on a 10-year delay in that grid decarbonization. How are the outcomes different under that scenario?
Yeah, happy to comment. I think that the assumptions going into the study are probably as realistic as one could be today. We used inputs that were based on pretty fundamental power sector modeling to estimate the emissions. And from what we're seeing, the state, I think, can still very plausibly meet their 70 by 30 goals. And in fact, with their recent Tier 4 procurements, there's actually a potential that the emission rate going into New York City could be even lower than we assumed when we were doing the study. Looking forward, I mean, 100 by 40 will continue to be challenging. There's no doubt there. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty going further out into the future. So it's hard to comment on kind of the plausibility. But I'll say out of all the states, New York is doing a lot of good work for planning and putting in the right processes to get that done. So, I think also note, I think we all generally agree that the emission factors should be reevaluated as we get into the later compliance periods. And, the city will need to strike a balance between providing enough lead time for planning, but while also being realistic about what the emissions are going to be. So in short, at the time, I think we were using very good forecasts, and even now with Tier 4 coming, it might even be a little bit more optimistic if everything goes as planned. And I think your second question was about the 10-year delay, right?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So I think what we see in the results is generally as things get harder to do and as it gets harder to meet the goals, trading can actually provide even more opportunity to reduce costs when it's easier to meet your goals, and the trading impacts can be a little bit subdued. So generally, we see more investment everywhere, including in EJCs in the pessimistic scenario with a delay, and the net benefits from trading relative to a scenario where you have a delay and you don't have trading are also higher. So generally, the high level kind of finding is if it's more difficult to achieve the goals, trading can generally reduce costs even more.
The harder it gets, the more valuable trading might become. Okay, that's really helpful, Casper. So I just want to remind everybody to put your questions into the Q&A function, not the chat function. And then you can upvote questions in Q&A. And so questions that the audience members want to see answered will be elevated. And we'll get to those a little bit later in the program. A second big finding that you touched on in the presentation, Danielle, from the study is this sort of highlight of the disparate burden, the residential sector facing more significant challenges over time than the commercial sector. And I want to turn to Mary on this one because I know HRNA did a lot of work on the building sector side of the study. Mary, can you unpack that differential impact for us a bit? What's the buildings data showing is behind that? Any insights you can share there?
Yeah, sure, Chris. So the main kind of driver between that disparate impact between residential and commercial is really the underlying sources of energy for those two sectors. So for commercial, 63% of their GHG emissions today are attributable to electricity, whereas only 39% in the residential sector is from electricity. And when you look at affordable housing, that's even lower, it's only 27%. And so because of that pre-existing difference in those fuel types for each of these different groups, when you're decarbonizing the electric grid, the sectors that are already more electrified or use more electricity will benefit from that decarbonization more rapidly. And so that result is really striking in that graph that Danielle showed, where even as those limits are increasingly strict in the commercial sector, a growing number of buildings are actually complying simply because of CLCK without any action. And then for the residential sector, that share falls dramatically because they're still relying on fuel. And that dynamic also kind of becomes the crux of the EJ issue because residential and commercial buildings are distributed differently across the city of New York, with more residential buildings being located in EJ areas. And so given that dynamic, when you do introduce trading, the general kind of mechanism there is that buildings that were once over-emitting and complying by paying penalties or buying RECs or offsets or installing retrofit measures, they now have the additional compliance option of buying credits. And then some buildings that are maybe closer to their emissions limits or already below them, they're now incentivized to further invest in energy retrofits and decrease emissions and then generate credits to sell. And those credits are then purchased by the over-emitters. And so generally what you see is that market rate and residential condos are buying credit, whereas the commercial sector is tending to sell credits. Although if you look across all sectors, there are buildings in every sector buying and selling because it's really more about the level of emissions intensity and not just a blanket statement on each of these building sectors. And in both proposals, we also modeled the option for affordable housing to opt into the trading system, since they're covered by Article 321, not by Article 320, they're not subject to those emissions caps. But if they do invest into energy retrofits, they can generate credits to sell into this market.
Excellent. So extending the driver to buildings that don't have carbon caps currently. Let's turn to environmental justice. I think this has been a central topic in the study for sure. It's actually in the statutory language requiring the study take place. And Danielle, you highlighted it in the overview presentation. I guess two questions. One is, can you walk us through some of the efforts the team has made to engage stakeholders through the process, both in environmental justice, but also other stakeholders as well? And then speak to the environmental justice concerns with trading and how the study went about trying to address those concerns.
Great. Thank you for that question. As you mentioned, environmental justice was absolutely a central consideration throughout the study, both looking to ensure that EJ communities would not be negatively impacted by trading, and more affirmatively trying to ensure that trading would actually benefit them beyond what would occur under Local Law 97 as is. In terms of the first part of your question, the stakeholder engagement, from the beginning, environmental justice groups were closely collaborating with us through two stakeholder processes, one of which Urban Green arranged and ran, another which the mayor's office themselves organized and coordinated. Adriana Espinoza, who is a senior advisor for environmental justice at the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, was the central driving figure in the study process as well. So really, we tried to ensure that voices were heard and engaged throughout the process to sort of, test out our ideas and provide feedback on different proposals that were being developed. In terms of the mechanics of how we tested out the impacts of the proposals on environmental justice communities, the first thing I would say is that we were very careful throughout the modeling exercises of separating out projected impacts for environmental justice communities as defined on our map, and then other communities. So when looking at things such as, pollution reductions or investment per square foot or tenant energy expenditure to evaluate the proposals, in each case, we looked at those, we disaggregated the projected impacts for EJCs and other areas, and then the city as a whole. Generally speaking, I should say that we did not find that adding a trading program, even a simple bare bones trading program, would have negative impacts for environmental justice communities. In fact, trading was found to improve air pollution in EJC simple trading over the 26 years compared to Local Law 97 as is, and avoid more deaths. But we did find that there could be a small increase in NOx in EJCs in the first 5 years of the program. And so that was part of what motivated some of the guardrails or very sort of intentional targeting measures that we included in the illustrative proposals.
Danielle, on that piece, what was behind the potential increase in NOx? And can you speak to the specific strategies the team adopted there?
Yeah, so basically what happens, and Kasparis, I hope will jump in at any point here since he really was the man holding the pen on the economic modeling, but what happens is that when there is no price signal to incentivize buildings to go beyond their emissions targets or to reduce more than they're required to under their emissions targets, what you have is that buildings that presently burn fuel oil number 4, which is the most polluting source of heating oil or of heating in New York City right now, those buildings wait all the way up until 2030 when fuel oil number 4 is in place to switch and then they switch to fuel oil number 2. With trading, what happens is that there's suddenly an incentive, or I'm sorry, I said it wrong. They switch to fuel oil 2 instead of fuel oil 4. With trading, what happens is that they go beyond that and they switch over to electrification instead of to fuel oil number 2, and so, or natural gas. And so what happens is that you end up with more emissions reductions overall, but less emissions reductions in the first 5 years. And so basically what we did with both of the trading proposals is, with the auction scenario where you subsidize the cost of retrofits in EJC buildings, in the first 5, you get this push in the first 5 years, which shifts the pollution reduction towards EJCs, or in the alternative, with the early phase out of fuel oil number 4, you wouldn't have that problem.
Great, thank you for unpacking that. Mary and Kasparis, I'm not sure which of you wants to take this question, but I'm wondering if you could sort of recap what the modeling tells us about how different building owners in different sectors will comply with a trading program, without a trading program. How does trading change the choices among compliance options across the different sectors?
I was finding it difficult for the mute button. Yeah, so generally, I'll start off with kind of a citywide view, which is that generally when trading is implemented citywide, we see a higher uptake of retrofit measures and a decrease in the usage of things like RECs and also paying penalties. So generally, the overall shift is towards more retrofits. When we start looking at it at a sector by sector basis, it really depends on kind of what proposal we're looking at and in what years. So generally what we see is that because a lot of the commercial buildings are quite electrified in the early years, they really benefit from the decarbonization of the grid. And so you see a fair amount of purchasing from other sectors, such as residential, who have higher cost solutions in the earlier years. In the later years, we actually see that switch sometimes with trading. And that's because in some of the proposals, say proposal number 1, where we have support for EJC areas, you have a lot more residential buildings in those areas, and you actually see quite an increase in uptake of measures, of retrofit measures in EJCs in residential buildings. And in which case, then you're actually seeing a switch where it's the residential buildings who are going further and providing credits. So it's not an easy thing to unpack, and it is quite complicated, but at the end of the day, it's the people who have the cheaper solutions that will see a general increase in retrofits. And then, you'll see some decrease in the buildings that have very expensive compliance options. And I will say, buying a credit from somebody isn't also necessarily offsetting a retrofit measure. It could be offsetting penalty payments. It could be offsetting, costly measures that they'll have to do later anyways, but they can delay or use some of their bank to go, over when the thresholds go down. So unfortunately, it's not a very simple a solution that comes from the modeling, but that's the general trends that we're seeing.
Great, thanks, Kasparis. We've heard how the study, ran a lot of different model runs, but ultimately chose 2 illustrative trading proposals. This is a question for all of you. Why were those 2 chosen? How did the team choose those 2 options? Or maybe put another way, what metrics were driving that decision? What were you solving for?
Yeah, I can start us out, and then Kasparis and Mary, please chime in. But So as you said, we did 15 runs of the model. So we tested out a lot of scenarios, and I don't think we have the time to run through all of them. But in terms of the metrics, we established 8 metrics at the beginning of the study that we would use to evaluate the different scenarios. They looked at things like, what is the amount of investment that was generated under the scenarios? How much GHG emissions were reduced? Were GHG emissions reduced earlier, than under 97 as is? What was the extent of co-pollutant reductions? NOx and SOx and particulate matter. And so we used those criteria to sort of lead us in the direction of what we felt to be 2 particularly promising models. I should also just note that there were 2 hard and fast exclusion criteria, which I mentioned at the outset of my presentation. One of them, which was there could be no increase in local air pollution in any year in EJCs. The other was there could be no increase in greenhouse gas emissions over the life of the program. So those were sort of the evaluative metrics and exclusionary criteria we used.
Great, thanks, Danielle. So we've got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to pivot to audience Q&A and overlap with what was ultimately going to be my last question. But before I do, I just want to say again, for the audience members, please upvote questions on the Q&A panel. Put your questions in there. We've got quite a few in there. The upvotes will push those questions to the top of the list and increase the likelihood they'll get asked. But so my last question and the first question on the audience list is really, what's the next step for carbon trading to become a reality? And I want to blend that with a general sentiment that I think many are intrigued by trading and think it has some potential benefits, but are also cautious because it seems complex. It is complex. And there are some challenges to overcome. So what is the next step, and what are key considerations as the city looks at the question of moving towards implementation?
Well, in terms of next steps, I mean, most straightforwardly, what needs to happen is the council probably needs to pass a new piece of legislation, amending Local 97 to permit trading. If the auction scenario were selected, there's a possibility that the city would want to get authorization from the state as well. In terms of the complications of running trading programs, you raise a very fair point, right? I mean, this would be something new. There's no getting around that. Something new for New York City. That said, at this point, policymakers writ large have a lot of experience running trading programs, right? I mean, there have been trading programs in the US going all the way back to the phase out of lead in the 1980s, to the SO2 trading program in the 1990s. So there's a lot of experience that has been acquired, maybe not in New York City directly with environmental trading, but in other areas of government. And the city wouldn't need to reinvent the wheel here, it wouldn't need to come up with its own playbook. I would also say that there's even some experience in New York City with types of trading programs, right? I mean, New York City has for a long time permitted tradable development rights. There are municipal environmental trading programs, at least one that's top of mind is the Washington, D.C. Stormwater Credit Program. And I think either, of these experiences should help to prepare the city and suggest that this is something that the city could gain the expertise necessary and combine with looking towards other experts and consultants to make this happen if they wanted to.
Great, thanks, Danielle. We have a question about sort of the mechanism, the financial mechanism of trading, how it results in funding or enough funding for a building B to actually pursue decarbonization measures or implement some retrofit measures. Do you have an example of how much money might be generated on a building by building basis? Can any of you speak to kind of the mechanics of that financing side of things and how trading might play into it?
Do you want to take that, Casper, or Mary, do you want me to?
Can have a go, but it'll be kind of more of a generic answer in that generally, what we've seen historically in markets is that, services develop to help participants kind of manage the trading program and take the most advantage of it. So, if this were to go forward, I would imagine services would become available that would effectively help building owners, use the trading program to lower their costs. There's a lot of uncertainty probably going forward in terms of what the credit prices will be, and so you'll be, as an owner, I expect, you'll be looking to get a decent sense of what the forecasted prices could be, which is partly why, we considered a price floor in one proposal to give, some certainty for decision making. But on top of that, it depends how the rules will be written, but I wouldn't be surprised if services get developed to effectively mediate and facilitate, trading of credits going forward.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I would add, I think there's a lot of models out there where this already really exists. I mean, credits are monetized for other things, carbon offsets and otherwise, that feed into a project financing. And you could even see third-party providers taking that risk, the price fluctuation risk. And so from a building owner's perspective, it would just be an additional financing line item. There's a question that I think we touched on a little in the panel, but I want to make sure we revisit it here. It's, in summary, it seems that residential building owners in EJ communities would be paying commercial building owners for credits. What am I missing? And I think it's a good question to focus on, because there is some aspect of that dynamic. But then, Kasparis, you also spoke to the uncertainty over time in that dynamic. So can one or more of you revisit that, and let's just unpack it a little bit further?
Yeah, sure. And Chris, do you mind just repeating the first part of that question so I'm entirely clear?
Sure. I think the question is essentially picking up that residential building owners in EJ communities may be paying commercial building owners for credits. So the credits would be generated in commercial buildings and then purchased by building owners in EJ communities. Is that the dynamic that's at play in the study? And if so, is that the dynamic over time?
Yeah, so I think when we look at it from a perspective of where the least cost opportunities are, especially early on, it is the case that the commercial sector has lower cost opportunities, in which case that dynamic could be true. When we were analyzing this, we were very conscious of that being a potential result that we would want to put guardrails against to ensure that there was investment in EJC communities. So when we look at proposal 1, you actually see a very dramatic increase in the amount of investment in EJCs, and that's driven by the funding support that is provided to EJCs, where they actually make it very competitive at a citywide, and you see that trend reverse.
No, I was just going to say the other thing I wanted to add to that dynamic is that something that's important to remember is that the residential sector, even to the extent that it would be buying credits as opposed to selling them, that's because the residential sector has the hardest time meeting its obligations under the law. And so the sort of flip side to this dynamic is that the buildings who most need the added flexibility of a trading program are the residential buildings, because those are the buildings who are most likely to see, their costs increase as a result of this law. And of course, those costs have to be borne by somebody, owner, tenant, et cetera.
It's also not really divided just between residential and commercial, but it's more driven by emissions intensity within each of those groups. So even within commercial, the higher emitting commercial buildings also tend to be in EJCs. So the properties that are buying credits aren't necessarily residential in this case. And what you see is for the lower emitting buildings, they can kind of over comply by implementing additional measures that reduce emissions and they can sell credits. And then for the higher emitting buildings across both residential and commercial sectors, they would be either buying credits or undertaking deeper measures that would allow them to generate credits, or they'd be switching from a penalty over to paying for credits. And it really all depends on the credit price and the timing of when you look at what's happening in this market.
Yeah, so even though you might have some localized dynamics, generally, and by localized I mean like one EJC commercial building, you know, that has expensive options could be buying it from a non-EJC commercial building. Both trading proposals generally lead to improved outcomes and more, you know, investment in EJCs.
Right. So to reiterate, the two proposals the team really unpacks in the study show significant benefit over time to both EJC and non-EJC buildings. And part of that is the complexities you're talking about and where the different sectors and the buildings are located, et cetera, but also the guardrails that the team looked at putting in place, such as auction revenue being reinvested back into EJCs, as an example. We have a question here about electrification. Did the modeling assume buildings are electrifying at a specific rate? And I don't know if Mary, that's a question for you, but I guess I would tack on to that. You know, what were the assumptions around retrofits implemented? What measures were buildings primarily undertaking?
So we didn't build any assumptions around there being kind of an accelerated rate of electrification. I noticed there's a question somewhere in here related to recent legislation that's been introduced regarding electrification of new construction. But looking just at the existing building stock, we kind of just implemented, you know, we brought in retrofit cost assumptions, retrofit savings assumptions, and basically modeled how owners would undertake these retrofits based on an economic calculus of the upfront costs versus the savings that they would get from each of those measures. And naturally, as a result, the measures that tend to be uptaken are the lower hanging fruit measures that include, you know, plug load efficiency, whereas the higher cost ones like wall insulation or electrification are really only uptaken by the most energy intensive buildings that have the best payoff in terms of implementing those cost savings. We did add a hard constraint to fuel out or phase out the fuel oil 4 and 6 by 2030 per the clean heat regulation. So that's the hardest constraint that we placed. And then in proposal 2, we accelerated that phase out to 2024, not 2030. But yeah, that's an overview of the measures that were uptaken across the market.
Got it. Thanks, Mary. And just to clarify, so one of the proposals was dependent on an accelerated phase out of fuel oil number 2, and then one of them is not. Is that correct?
Fuel oil number 4, yes.
Or sorry, fuel oil number 4. Yeah, sorry, my mistake there. Okay, great. There's a question about consideration given to extending trading to buildings not covered by Local 197. And the question is specifically thinking about buildings under 25,000 square feet. Now, you mentioned the opt-in. Can you just briefly, and quite briefly, because we only got a couple more minutes, say what the opt-in applies to and what it doesn't apply to?
Sure. So in a sentence, the opt-in option applied to buildings that were covered by Article 321. So those are the mostly affordable housing buildings that have 35% rent or more rent regulated units, but which are also larger than 25,000 square feet. Also, we provided an option for NYCHA buildings to opt in, which are covered under a different standard under Local Law 97. We did not look at the potential for buildings less than 25,000 square feet to opt in.
Great. So let's take one last final question, a lightning round. There's a question asking what you feel is the biggest risk to carbon trading. If carbon trading goes forward, what is the biggest risk that we should be focused on?
That's a tough one. You know, I think that the worst case scenario is that the market doesn't properly function because there's, you know, some sort of lack of integrity to it, perhaps some sort of fraud or et cetera and so forth. You know, but I would hope, again, given the decades of experience that we've accrued now with running these markets throughout the US and the world, that those problems could be ironed out.
Great. So focused
I'll add
on
one.
Yeah, please, Casper.
Yeah, I'll add one note. I think, you know, ensuring that, you know, the way the program is set up is clearly articulated and there's education for building owners to ensure that they know kind of how best they can utilize trading to meet their needs will be very important going forward. And, you know, I think it'll be responsibility of the industry, but also partly of the city to kind of ensure that owners can make use of it as best as they can.
Great. There was a question on how the Adams administration may respond to trading, but I've left that one to the side because I don't think any of you have the ability to share anything there. So I want to say thank you to our three panelists, Danielle, Mary, and Kasparis, for this very informative presentation and discussion. Thanks to all of you for joining. Before we go, I just want to highlight a few upcoming events we have. Tomorrow we have our Young Professionals Happy Hour. And then in the new year, on January 20th, we have a G-Pro Construction Management course. And on January 27th, we have a public program focused on our most recent report called Grid Ready. It just came out. It's all about powering New York City's all-electric buildings and what that means for the grid and how ready our grid is. So please join us for one or more of those events. And thank you again to all the panelists for today, but also for all your work on this incredible and really insightful study. Thanks to everyone, and happy holidays all around.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everyone else. Bye.